Welcome to the Mundaria Legends podcast. I am your host and narrator, Michael Stone. Today we begin our first season, and I cannot tell you how honored I am to have you join us. Though we have only just begun as a very small studio, we have had people across the world listen to our first teaser episode a few weeks ago, including the UK, Mexico, and even Argentina, and the reception has been outstanding to see. As promised, this show's stories are about your ideas, as we feature high fantasy characters some of you have suggested to us at MundariaLegends.com. Remember, if you enjoy what we're doing, there's 3 easy things you can do to help support the show. First, you can leave your rating and a review on the podcast platform you're using. Second, you can support us directly by subscribing to our Patreon page and becoming a patron, where you can earn awesome members-only benefits like merch from the show, a higher chance to have your character ideas featured in one of our episodes, and even exclusive special episodes. Last, but perhaps the most important way to support us, is to tell others you know about the show. Now, many of you have waited patiently for these past few weeks, and I am excited to finally share with you our first story, starring a character created by a listener named Abby from Green River in the USA. And now, without further ado, we bring to you Episode 1, Conventions of War. Aeltha took a deep breath and held it. 4 seconds. Her feathered brow furrowed, her eyes closed. She repeated to herself the words, "There is only the feather. There is no deep." Exhale, but not too quickly. Measured, precise. 4 seconds. Release, but only a trickle of air. There is only the feather. There is no deep. She had to keep her hands relaxed. The brown feathered wings along her arm had to be still. No ruffles. 4 seconds. Don't breathe. Empty and still. Her talons relaxed beneath her. Her beak was silent. No whistle of air. Disciplined, precise, controlled. The next breath, she could try it again. Take the breath in. 4 seconds. Feel it fill the breast. Measured and counted. No breath wasted. Breath was the life wind, a gift from Yale, the first Bladehand, the wind giver. The deep tugged at Aeltha's thoughts. Dare she assume to demand such reverence as the wind giver? Dare she assume his title? When she couldn't even... No interruption. 4 seconds, hold the breath. Prepare to release and see only the feather. There was no deep. And there the feather was, sitting on her desk in the tent. She released on count, willing her god shard, the power of the skies, Prokelha, to lift, to spin the feather. Gently, a vortex. Nothing else, nothing fancy. She opened her round brown, owl-like eyes. The feather was lifting, a slight breeze from the small vortex she was making, brushing her feathers like the wake of a friend passing by. The feather was spinning, not frantically, no. Just even, measured to her count. 4 seconds, a rotation. 4 seconds, then continue her breathing. There was only the feather. There was no... The feather caught the light from her oil lamp. A flash of golden brown. A memory. The gust began to swirl faster. Aeltha closed her eyes again. Slow it. Stop it. But don't overcorrect. Back to the rhythm. Back to the pace. There is only the feather. There must be no deep. The memory could not be denied so easily, however. Aeltha saw her as if it was the now. Caelthal, scowling like she always did, fleeing through the monastery window, her feathers catching the warm spring sunset. Gone. No! Close it off. Close off the winds. Calm the growing squall. Enough practice for today. Aeltha opened her eyes again. The feather swung like a pendulum on its way down, silently mocking Aeltha's brittle discipline. It at least had not shot through the tent fabric, as the other feathers had, but even that fact was a trifling comfort. Hatchlings not 6 years old could control their spinning feathers with ease. And here Aeltha was, well over twice their age, lucky that she hadn't lost control of her powers again. Pathan's voice from outside her spacious tent snapped her focus back into place. "Lady Aeltha, they are ready for you." Aeltha paused. Then, much more assertively and calmly than she was feeling, she called back, "Thank you, Squire Pathan. Allow me a moment. I've just been exercising." Her bloodshot eyes yearned for the solemnity of her perch. She hadn't stayed up the full night, as she did simply drift off when exhaustion overwhelmed her nerves, but such respite from her dread only kept her asleep for just less than an hour during each instance. Somehow, she thought that if she could just master that basic exercise finally, that would somehow mean that she was meant to be here, that maybe somehow she'd be able to control her powers the right way, like the others. She knew it was silly, but somehow that quest to accomplish this one small thing had engrossed her vision, and now that she had failed even in that little thing, it made facing all the bigger things today that much worse. Having run out of time to prepare, however, gave her enough to go on in order to step forward and adorn herself in her leather armor. Getting dressed, getting cleaned up, these were things she could do. At least that was something. Maybe she could kid herself into thinking that would be enough. She completed her morning routine quickly enough, and was just about to leave her tent when a vague lightness on her belt held her in place. She caught herself mid-breath, then closed her eyes in the briefest moment of self-pity as she sighed. Of course. We wouldn't want to forget that, would we? She thought. She turned around, and somehow wasn't mystified by the sight of the blade in her tent. There it sat, in its scabbard, an unassuming piece of metal, whose only distinguishing features were the crossguards pointing in a curve towards the tip of the blade, along with the forgotten runes etched in gold along its edge. Strange it was that such a simple bit of metal could invoke such devotion from her people, that it could itself be worthy of veneration and prayers. She reached forward and held it in her hand, and then attached the scabbard to her belt. She couldn't afford to pretend it wasn't a part of her anymore. She had to bear its burden and be the Bladehand, no matter how much she might wish otherwise. As Aeltha strode towards the door of the spacious tent the Roost Elders had supplied her, she breathed in, locking her face into the dutiful, opaque expression she would have to wear as a mask for the majority of the day. There was nothing for it. She could stall no longer. And so, she stepped through the tent flaps, and saw what last night's evening darkness couldn't show. She knew last night when she had arrived at the Ma'Eli war camp was large, but she couldn't help but briefly be taken aback by how many soldiers King Aglam had mustered to lay siege to Cruz. Already in the early hours of the dawn, most of the camp was awake, alert, and if the clashing of metal dishes and columns of pit fires were any indication, eating. The dark blue tents of the Ma'Eli land forces gave something of the illusion of the sea itself having swallowed the beach. Considering how many hydromancers King Aglam was reported to have convinced to fight alongside these common soldiers, the metaphor likely wasn't purely abstract. Her squire, clad in the simple white and blue leather armor of he and Aeltha's Arthurlan heritage, gave the Bladehand a courteous bow. "Lady Aeltha, good morning. Aglam's reception area is down closer to the shoreline," Pathan informed her. His mutely bronze wing grasped the halberd he was holding sternly. His back was straight, his pauldrons gleaming with the dull morning sun. He was the picture of martial professionalism, and yet with a simple sincerity about his smile. "We can proceed immediately down there if you are ready," he added simply. Aeltha maintained her detached expression as she mused. "You make it sound like I have a choice to make going down there." Pathan bowed his mutely bronze feathered head. "Only a suggestion, milady. With respect, you are the Bladehand. King Aglam needs you, and thus having him wait for you longer likely won't be a noticeable offense to him. His forces may have that tidal dragon to call on once each month, but King Aglam is hoping to have a more consistent ally, and that is what you can provide." He looked back up at her, with a curious expression playing again on his face. Aeltha had grown accustomed to seeing reverence, awe, and unapologetically gaping curiosity during the past year since she had been given the blade. But she had yet to decipher the annoying calm on Pathan's face whenever she saw him. He had been assigned to her only a week or so after she had received custody of the banishing blade, but even after a year of his service, She still hadn't yet figured out the mystery of this squire. It was like he knew something she didn't, like she was missing some joke, or had embarrassed herself somehow. But he wouldn't laugh, wouldn't give away whatever coy secret he had gleaned. Just the annoying calm. Eiltha wouldn't let Pathan have the satisfaction of whatever game he was playing at, however. "Thank you, squire, but we can go down now. No point in abandoning decorum." Pathan bowed, not showing any hint of disgruntlement at having his suggestion so casually tossed aside. "Of course, milady. I will lead the way and introduce your ladyship." "Never mind that, Pathan. There's no need for such formality now. I'm going to have to endure plenty of it later," Eiltha gave in a mild reprimand. A pause from Pathan. Was he angry that he wasn't going to proudly announce the Bladehand to the gathered crowd in front of King Aglum? There couldn't be that many perks to being a squire, and being the center of attention, even for the briefest of moments, had to be something anyone in his station would look forward to. But again, if he was frustrated in any degree by having another suggestion shot down by Eiltha, he didn't show it. "As you command, Bladehand," he simply uttered, bowing and holding out his right wing towards the direction of King Aglum's reception tent. As Eiltha proceeded down the gently sloping hill towards the shoreline, Pathan turned smartly in place and followed. As the feathered pair made their way, Eiltha took note of the soldiers rimming the path. Many of the soldiers sharpening their swords or repairing their armor were human, but a few mer-crabbed officers also made their rounds, shouting out the morning's orders from their superiors. Many of the soldiers took second glances at Eiltha as she walked down, their eyes focusing in on her wings and beak, and then for a longer time on the blade on her waist. Once Eiltha would have daydreamed about so much attention from so many men, but at age 19 she knew better of men to feel so flattered in a war camp. Curiosity at the novelty of having an avian, then quickly being outshone by the presence of the banishing blade of legend, hopefully eclipsed any baser impulses of these soldiers. Eiltha knew there would be women in the army as well, but with the way Ma'Eli society was, any woman who had the stubborn persistence to fight her way into the army was rare and few in between. Soon enough, Eiltha came to a large open tent, with its flap doors open on all sides, so as to accommodate the many officers and clerks making their way in and out of the king's makeshift reception area. As she entered the dark blue tent, her eyes were drawn immediately to the far end of the tent, where torchlight illuminated the face of King Aglum, leader of the Ma'Eli nation and its forces. Eiltha had heard tell that the former Ma'Eli king was portly to the extreme, but his brother Aglum was, well, much more fit, to be sure. His large, muscular torso very much befitted a merman who had led his people in this slow, grinding war of attrition. His eyes were a steely gray, glinting in the firelight, along with his necklace of what appeared to be various kinds of shark teeth. He seemed to have been scanning the entrances to his reception area as Eiltha walked in, and for whom Eiltha had little doubt, especially as he locked his gaze on her when she entered, sat forward in his seat, and beckoned in a deep, hearty voice. "And so the Bladehand arrives. Welcome, Eiltha, daughter of Tseru. Please join us for breakfast here at my side." Opaque and controlled. Can't let the eyes that are now turning your way set your nerves off, Eiltha thought. She took steady, measured breaths as she made her way to the king's table, navigating an aisle between two of the long tables set perpendicularly from the king, seeing an exquisitely prepared setting of nuts and berries being brought by a human attendant to a chair just to the left of Aglum. Obviously, the Ma'Eli had gone to great lengths to discover what her preferred foods were. Even the mix of flax, walnut, and sunflower seeds, along with the cherries, looked to be in just the proportions that Eiltha's late mother would have prepared. Someone must really want me to be impressed, Eiltha thought. The chatter and hubbub that had previously occupied the space gently faded into an odd silence. Again, as Eiltha felt the eyes in the room follow her and her blade, she steadied her breathing, maintained her poise. There was only her seat. There was no deep. Taking her place next to the king, she sat and took her spoon. "You'll have to tell me if our chefs did their job properly, Bladehand Eiltha," the king graciously invited. Compliantly scooping up the nut and berry medley, Eiltha pecked a small beakful, crunched, and swallowed. The Ma'Eli had done well. It was a taste of home. Feeling the king's eyes to her right, she looked up and nodded at Aglum, smiling. "Thank you kindly, King Aglum. I am honored you would work so hard to prepare me such a treat." A tinge of relief seemed to wash over the king.
"Ah, thank goodness. In truth, I was uncertain that avian dishes required such little effort. No grilling, cooking, steaming. I'll have to tell my chefs that they have no need to stew over it."
He guffawed. Eiltha raised an eyebrow. Pathan, standing behind her to her left, whispered, "Perhaps he just genuinely believes himself to be that funny." Eiltha nodded. Somehow, Pathan excusing the king's use of a pun put her slightly more at ease. She nodded slightly and continued to eat.
"All joking aside, we are truly grateful you have deemed it fit to join our expedition, Bladehand," Aglum regally declared. "I believe that you will come to agree that the cause is just and the need is dire."
"As a point of order, King Aglum," Eiltha began, "I have not joined your expedition yet. I am glad you have provided space for my tent, but the decision to involve the Order of the Blade in this war has not yet been made." The king seemed to freeze momentarily, not accustomed to being corrected so publicly. Death sight take it all, Eiltha thought. Even if he is the one that was needing the most to impress someone, that didn't excuse Eiltha from quibbling with him over semantics. She wasn't 3 bites into her food, and already she had managed to mess things up. Luckily, the king decided to rescue them both.
"But of course, my apologies. You still have yet to make your decision. That is of course the rule."
The king turned forward to address the rest of his gathered generals.
"Again, I must tell you, Bladehand, I am truly happy to have you, especially here with my generals. I do not know of a braver or a more loyal group of leaders in all the seas than these."
The king raised his glass of wine in a toast. Remembering this custom, Eiltha quickly grabbed her own glass and raised it along with the rest of the crowd. When they finished drinking, King Aglum resumed.
"I can also vouch for the soldiers that follow these generals. During these past 9 months, they have seen much of war. Too much."
Aglum grabbed some shrimp from his breakfast platter, preparing to dip it in some kind of vegetable paste Eiltha didn't recognize. "Too much war?" Seeing the king's raised eyebrow, Eiltha quickly followed up with, "Forgive me, I am simply curious. You've laid siege to Cruz for an impressive amount of time. I have wondered what's kept your proud forces going." The king nodded, seeming to be appeased with Eiltha's quick recovery.
"But of course, I myself did not anticipate being here this long. But every time we try to push forward through to their capital, Strathdrix, those lizards fight back like the worst of demons."
The king stared forward, lost in memory.
"The things we see, what those pyromancers can do. I thought I used to hate these lizards for what they did to my brother. Now..."
A much more somber, darker feeling shrouded the king's face for a moment. Uncomfortable with the silence, Eiltha inquired, "And they have refused to yield to Prince Chiral?" The mention of the prince seemed to sour the king's mood even further.
"Yes, I imagine that's been the subject of much speculation across all of Mundaria, and not just among your people. But there's still no explanation. I have tried sending messages, couriers, ambassadors, spies. Nothing. Wherever they are hiding him in that labyrinth of a city, he's tucked away somewhere very deep."
Eiltha felt a slight twinge of disappointment. She had surely thought that Aglum would have known something more than the gossip mongers she had overheard for the past 9 years. "Forgive me, King Aglum."
"Nonsense! No need to apologize, Bladehand. Asking these questions is exactly why you are here.
the king explained in a matter-of-fact voice. Eiltha nodded. Of course. King Aglum, do you suppose that Chiral is... Eiltha tried to think of how to finish the sentence, what to say, instead of, dead? The king helpfully interjected. To tell the truth, part of me wishes he were. Eiltha couldn't hide the startled look on her face. Seeing this, the king shook his head and whispered, You misunderstand. I loved my nephew. The thought that he might have somehow gone along with all of this willingly, that he may have had a hand in my brother's death, that's one of the heavier burdens I bear as king in this war. News that Chiral is dead would either mean that he has been brought to justice, or that perhaps he was not as willing a participant in all this as we've been led by the Drakonids to believe. Eiltha nodded, understanding. Her anxieties at being in front of so many people in the king's reception tent had not fully gone away, but somehow hearing the king describe his inner turmoil made her own burden somewhat lighter. And you are certain he hasn't left Cruz? Eiltha asked. Aglum nodded his head, his crown glinting in the torchlight. If there's one thing we Ma'Eli can do, it's enforce a blockade. Nothing has gone past my hydromancers, my fleet, and the merfolk. The king's breast swelled with pride, speaking more loudly again to allow the rest of his generals to give their assenting nods and cheers as he continued. The Drakonids can fly over land all they want, but whenever they go over the seas, they are mine. My hydromancers can make short work of anyone who challenges our supremacy over these waters. Even old Steelclaw. Where in one moment Eiltha had been calmly distracted by the mystery of Prince Chiral, in the next she was frozen with the piercing, sheer cold of shock. The king was looking forward towards his gathered generals, reveling in his tale, oblivious to the change in Eiltha's composure. Yes, it was just 2 months ago that old Steelclaw attempted to intercept our supplies headed here. Aglum continued to talk, and it was all Eiltha could do to keep herself pulled together. Somehow, the mention of her again. It opened the wound afresh. The pain came back as sharp as it had before. All worries Eiltha had of appearing again in public as the Bladehand evaporated instantly, her world shattered. Again. Wasn't too easy, of course, to take down that ship, the Ravager. Like the Order of the Blade, Steelclaw's crew had all types from all over Moondaria. Very talented, too. Except these pirates were nowhere near as honorable, nowhere near as professional, of course, the king added, barely acknowledging or noticing Eiltha as he continued his narrative. As soon as Steelclaw began firing her cannon on my ship, Prayer to Razla here, the king gestured helpfully towards a human official, some 7 or so seats down the row of one of the long tables, didn't hesitate. He and 2 of his staff used their hydromancy to cleave Steelclaw's ship in 2. A single blow! All aboard were taken prisoner, save the captain. You might actually find this interesting. She really was an avian, Bladehand Eiltha. The king turned to Eiltha, looking to see the Bladehand's reaction. His jovial demeanor quickly melted away, however, when he saw Eiltha's wide eyes, tears streaming. Caught off guard, the king quickly asked, Bladehand, what is... Then, making a guess, he said, yes, well, there were Ma'Eli on that ship, too. Completely understand your outrage. Traitors to their nations, these pirates. Even your elders had put out a bounty for Steelclaw's talons. Eiltha's beak dropped open in shock. Out of the corner of her eyes, she could see that some others on the table were worriedly looking around, seeing a strong gust beginning to pick up, swirling around the tent. That didn't concern Eiltha right now, however. The king's nervous laugh faltered, and his face fell into confusion instead.
Bladehand, what is it?
Aeltha stood, turning to the Mer King reclining in his chair. And you did that? You took her talons? All eyes were on Aeltha and the king. And though the crowd had fallen silent, a swirling wind had begun to pick up even more fiercely around the tent. The king noticed the gust too, deducing correctly the source of that problem at the least. Lady Aeltha, Bladehand, you need to stop. Please, calm down. The winds rushed faster in a short burst, mirroring Aeltha's flash of anger. You killed her! You... And then she saw the king's shark-tooth necklace glint again. One of the larger teeth on the necklace was covered with metal, with steel. And it was then that chaos broke in the reception tent. The swirling squall Aeltha had unintentionally summoned knocked almost everyone from their seats to the floor. Food, cutlery, and beverages hurtled out of the space like a hurricane of so many arrows. The gathered guests yelled in surprise and shock, and though the gust was strong enough to tear the tent canvas above the crowd, it fortunately did not knock the tent poles out of place, though a couple posts had snapped in two, causing portions of the tent ceiling to droop down somewhat. The freak wind having dissipated almost as soon as it came, Aeltha acted on instinct. She reached out and seized the king's necklace and pulled it sharply off his neck with a snap. Nearby guards who had only just started to get up began to shout, "Stop! Get back!" Aeltha took the necklace and placed it in her pocket. Wordlessly, she bolted back towards her tent, running from the scene, trying to outrun the hurt. Pathan was the first to catch up with Aeltha, though she was already behind her tent flap, sobbing quietly, holding the necklace in front of her. Lady Aeltha, are you all right?" the squire asked, breathing heavily from having bolted up the hill, either by foot or by wing Aeltha couldn't tell. Lady Aeltha, they'll be here any moment. What do you want us to do? Aeltha managed to speak, but only barely. What? Us? Pathan answered. Yes, my lady. The order has gathered. We are all out front. But the Ma'Eli are furious about what happened. A pause. What was Pathan doing? Was he angry too? And at whom? Her squire spoke slowly, but just loudly enough for Aeltha to hear. Please, Lady Aeltha, I know you probably just want to stay in this tent and let that fish broil himself in his outrage. And you'd probably be right too. I won't pretend to understand everything that is going on, but Pathan struggled for words for perhaps the first time Aeltha had known him. This alone caught her attention through the tempest of anger the steel-plated claw in front of her was summoning. We trust you, Aeltha. The order stands behind you, my lady. If you want us to send these Ma'Eli all the way back to their own island, you just let us know. Aeltha was shaking from the anger. How could this have happened? Her anger at King Aglim knew no bounds, but it was beginning to seep towards others. She was angry at the Ma'Eli Praetor for ordering them to do it. She was angry at the Crus for having brought the Ma'Eli so far out of their own seas. She was angry at Pathan for having brought her out of her tent. And she absolutely hated herself for feeling anything in the first place. Pathan continued, Please, my lady, I don't know if you are still listening, but I have an idea. You just stay in there, okay? No one else has to know. No one else has to know how hurt you are right now, okay? Despite all her anger, a small bud of confusion began to crop up out of the cold, hard ground of hurt in Aeltha's heart. Pathan? And as Pathan explained his plan, Aeltha finally took notice that she had been about to blow her tent from its own stakes with another squall. It calmed to a mournful swell of a breeze as she listened, wept, and agreed. Whatever angle Pathan was playing at, it was the only one she could play for the moment. And so, though it hurt, she confided in him and told him what he needed to know. A few moments later, having agreed on what needed to be done, Aeltha rested the blade next to her bed and held the king's necklace in her hands, the steel talon absorbing almost all her focus. There was only the deep. A few moments later, Pathan turned away from her ladyship's tent towards the gathering crowd at the edge of the Order's makeshift driftwood fence between their tents and the rest of the Ma'Eli encampment below. Amazingly, the Ma'Eli king had his palanquin bearers bring him up all the way to the gates of the Order's camp. Many other wielders in the Order, clad in the various robes of their separate nations and peoples, stood as sentries at the camp's edge, denying His Majesty entry. "You! You're the avian that was with her! Get her down here and have her explain all this now!" Aglum demanded. Pathan swallowed up his courage and stood firm. "Excuse me, sir, but her ladyship will not entertain any further conversations with your forces. You will direct your inquiries to me, and I will relay any message you have for her ladyship to her." Aglum stood agape. "What is the meaning of this?" Pathan didn't budge. "You heard me. If you want to have any hopes of having the Bladehand or our order assisting the Ma'Eli forces here in any way in the future, you'll have to deal with me. Her ladyship is done talking with you." Aglum looked as if he had just been slapped. Indeed, for a moment, he looked very much as if he wanted to slap Pathan. Instead, he elected to follow a more diplomatic approach. Still adopting a very stern expression, he glared at the young squire as he declared, "Very well. I understand that her ladyship has taken some kind of offense at the death of one of her own people." The king's hardly calm exterior broke somewhat as he quickly added, "Even though said avian was a murderer and a thief, and was executed completely within the bounds of both our nation's laws." "Law has little to do with the matter, King Aglum," Pathan interrupted. King Aglum looked as if his fishy eyeballs would pop out from the temper he was holding back. Miraculously, he managed to keep his voice to a restrained, even-toned, as he inquired, "And what, pray tell, is the matter? What possibly could have merited the Bladehand's childish abuse of her godshard of skies? She could have killed someone down there." The other members of the Order of the Blade, some human and some elvish, orcish, and stranger still, looked towards Pathan for an answer. He responded, "And yet it seems she didn't. At least, that seems to be the case. Otherwise, I imagine you'd be screaming for her extradition to one of your Ma'Eli courts right now." As King Aglum continued to fume, Pathan didn't waste his time. "Very simply, King Aglum, Steelclaw was not just some random avian citizen gone astray. She was the previous holder of the Banishing Blade, Caithal Thyrus, sister of Aeltha Thyrus." Recognition dawned on the king's brow for a moment. The surprise, however, quickly morphed into disgust. "You mean to tell me that this pirate, responsible for not only many deaths among my people from her previous raids, but your own as well, was once entrusted with something as holy as the Banishing Blade itself?" Pathan shook his head. "Again, King, you misunderstand. Caithal Thyrus had inherited the right to the blade, as her father was its prior owner. Caithal Thyrus had left our nation several years ago, however, and left the Banishing Blade in the Thyrus Manor." King Aglum's eyes narrowed. "The Steel Claw simply abandoned the most cherished, revered position among your people, along with the most powerful weapon in Mundarian history, to live a life of a common criminal?" Pathan nodded. "Yes." King Aglum had eyes only for the avian squire in front of him, as he flatly asked, "And this was because—" Pathan shook his head. "No." King Aglum's eyes burned into Pathan's. "What do you mean, no?" Pathan steeled himself and did his best to keep his voice even and calm. "I mean, no, Her ladyship does not need to explain everything to you at this time. What she requires of you is a formal public apology, as well as any other remains of Caelthal's body, before she reconsiders the Ma'Eli request for the Order's intervention. King Aglum fell silent. Pathan was almost certain that the king was going to kill him on the spot. After only a few seconds that had to their observers seemed an hour, King Aglum responded, "No, I don't care how powerful your wielders are. No amount of military assistance is worth the shame you propose to bring on my head. Do you have any idea who it is you are dealing with?" Aglum's eyes were wild with fury. He signaled his palanquin bearers, some humans who had seemed relieved to take a break from navigating even a short hill with their load, to lift him up again. They complied, hoisting their king into the air as he loomed above the gathered crowd. "We have struggled too long, fought too hard, to have this avian force us to grovel at our feet. We have no need of these pretenders, who can never hope to swim in the wake of the legacies of their predecessors. I have looked into the eyes of this supposed Bladehand, and all I see is a little girl, too afraid of the world around her to fulfill her duty to it. We who have struggled here these 9 long months have no need of Bladehands or their simpering minions. You have proven your valor year after blood-soaked year. Leave these children to their games of guarding the hurt feelings of this pretender of a Bladehand. Let this avian sob over the last fragment of her criminal sister. We still have your strength. We still have your valiance. And when the sea rises to its highest crest, we still have the tidal dragon." Even more applause broke forth at the mention of the beast. Pathan knew well enough that they had plenty of reason to cheer the flying serpent that had ravaged the Drakonids at the second spring tide each month. King Aglum rose his hand, briefly calling his soldiers' attention to him again as he concluded, "And we shall press our siege until Stratherix breaks, and we finally avenge our fallen dead. For Ma'Eli!" A rush of applause from the Ma'Eli soldiers in their dark blue armor gushed forth. As the king's palanquin turned to make its way down the hill, Pathan turned towards the tent some 15 paces behind him, his thoughts solely focused on the woman he left in her tent, wondering how much of the king's rantings she had heard, and how soon he could dare approach her again. Thank you so much for listening. Remember to like, subscribe, and leave a rating for us to let us know what you liked in this episode. You can also support us on patreon.com. Just look for Mundaria Legends or use the link in the description. And remember, one of the simplest, easiest ways you can support us is simply by letting a friend know about the show. Thank you again so much for listening, especially as we just get started. Stay safe and remember, you can't see the hero if you don't know the monster.